All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Pub Theology. Greetings, greetings. If I can have your attention for just a second. Good evening. All right, we're so glad you're here. We know this has become the spot to be on Monday evenings. Thank you for being here. The goal is to create a safe place where we can talk theology in a way that we can all connect with and ask questions to. And so for your presence here, for those speakers who have been willing to come, we're super grateful. Let me say a few opening words, and then we're going to get right to our speaker, whom I know you're looking forward to hearing from. My name is Ken Brannon. I am the Vice Rector at St. Michael and All Angels Church. And St. Michael Church, if you don't know about it, is at Douglas and Colgate near Preston Center. And so if you are looking for a church, if you would like to stop by anytime, we would love to welcome you. St. Michael is a great place to explore and ask your questions and really be who God has made you to be. We have a bunch of worship styles. We have kid-friendly, we have contemporary, we have traditional, and some things in between. So there's really a lot of different styles for different folks. We hope you'll come check us out. If you'd like to learn more about St. Michael, it's stmichael.org. Just look it up, stmichael.org. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about our schedule here for the next little bit. I will finish my intro, and then we'll have a 35 to 45-minute talk. We'll take a 10 to 15-minute break, and obviously you can do whatever you need to do in that break, but here is the key thing. There are cards at the tables, and we want you to be thinking of your questions. As the speaker talks, as he shares some things, if you have questions, jot them down, just leave them at your table, and during this break, we'll have people come around, collect those cards, and then we'll give them to the speaker to sort through. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll get to a bunch of them. Also, there's a QR code at your table. Here's a special incentive. If you follow that QR code and you take the survey, it's a really nice thing to do because it helps us know what you're interested in and how we can improve, so that's a thing. But secondly, you get entered into our raffle if you do this QR code, and I have in my pocket a $50 gift card to Vector Brewing. So if you'll go into the QR code, participate, you will be entered into that raffle. All right, I'm getting there. Tonight, I am pleased to tell you that we're going to hear from the Reverend Dr. Andrew Grosso, who I'm going to actually read formal things about him. He is awesome. If you ever get a chance to go somewhere where he's teaching, go, because I promise you he has thought about the topic deeply, and he will invite you into deeper consideration of the matter. So Andrew's a friend. He's a trusted colleague. He's our senior associate for discipleship. And then let me also tell you this about him. He joined the St. Michael and All Angels team in March 21. He has served at Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in Columbia, South Carolina, Nashotah House Theological Seminary in Nashotah, Wisconsin, Trinity Episcopal Church in Atchison, Kansas, the Bishop Kemper School for Ministry in Topeka, Kansas, and Grace Episcopal Cathedral in Topeka, Kansas. He is from Michigan. He completed his undergraduate studies in psychology at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He began his graduate studies at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, where he completed an MA in interdisciplinary studies. His doctoral studies were in the areas of systematic and philosophical theology, and he received his PhD from Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and his dissertation title was Personal Being, Polanyi, Ontology, and Christian Theology. I know 4 out of those 8 words, but I do commend it to you because I know it's good. In preparation for ordination, Andrew completed a Master of Divinity at the School of Theology at the University of the South, and he and his wife, Diana, live in Mesquite. Other fun facts that you wouldn't know unless you came here: he loves hot tea, he eats soup every day for lunch, and he has a long background in martial arts. So you can think about all of that with him at some point. Our topic tonight is Duel or Dance, Faith and Science in the Modern World. Will you give it up for Andrew Grosso?
So the guy Ken was talking about couldn't make it, so they asked me to fill in. So my name's Joe. Thanks very much. Please be sure to go back and help yourself to the drinks. The more you drink, the better I'll sound. Okay. Let me start by thanking you for coming tonight, and let me also begin by saying that what we're going to do tonight is do a very, well, maybe not a terribly deep dive, but we're going to look at just one particular question out of the 2 million questions that we could ask about this topic. There are so many different things that we could talk about relative to the relationship between science and theology and science and faith, that if I just spent the rest of my time enumerating them, I still wouldn't finish the topic. So what I want to do is I want to kind of curtail your expectations. Come on in, folks. Please come on in. Curtail your expectations a little bit by encouraging you to think about whatever questions you might want to ask. Just keep track of them along the way, because we're definitely not going to get to all of them during the presentation itself. What I want to do tonight is I want to essentially lead you to a point at which we give consideration to the Christian doctrine of creation. I'm going to cheat and I'm going to put my thesis out in front as a way of just kind of giving you some sense of where I'm going. The argument I'm going to make tonight is that fundamentally the practice of science assumes a theological framework. And the theological framework that is assumed by the practice of the empirical sciences is the Christian doctrine of creation. That's where we're going. Now, how are we going to get there? I've got 4 big sections in this presentation that I want to cover. First, I want to talk a little bit about the relevance of the question. Is the question of the relationship between faith and science relevant to our daily lives, or is this just some academic head trip that only people in ivory towers need to worry about? I then want to talk about ways in which the relationship between faith and science, or theology and science, has been problematized, ways in which people have identified that relationship as in some way, shape, or form problematic. What are the issues or the questions that have encouraged people to think that there is a problem in the relationship between the two? Then in my third section, I want to rethink the nature of the problem, because I think the fundamental issue that we have in the relationship between faith and science is actually that we don't understand the issue. We have mischaracterized the problem, and because we have mischaracterized the problem, we find it intractable. We find it insoluble. So I want to try and reframe the problem, and that reframing will then lead to the fourth section, in which what I'm going to propose is the Christian doctrine of creation. The Christian account of the world as God's creation is actually the thing that makes the practice of science not only possible, but necessary. So that's where we're going. Okay. Let me also, before I get too deeply into this, let me also start with a shameless plug. If you find anything that I say this evening of interest, let me encourage you to come back to St. Michael and All Angels in October of this year, when we will be doing a multi-week series on the relationship between faith and science as part of our adult education Sunday morning offerings. So more on faith and science in the next couple of months. And come on back to St. Michael and All Angels, regardless, whether or not you like faith and science. Okay, so let me start with an examination of the relevance of the question. Is this just an academic issue, right? I mean, we've got these very egg-headed ideas about what science is. We think of physicists in their laboratories. We think of theologians with their books in the libraries and all of that kind of stuff. Does this really matter in terms of the way we experience the world and in terms of the way we exercise our daily lives? I want to suggest that, yes, in point of fact, this question is essential for our daily lives, because both faith and science impact us in so many ways, on so many levels, pretty much all the time, that we almost fail to recognize it. We are constantly involved in a negotiation of the relationship between faith and science in our own lives. That's because both faith and science bear witness to particular accounts of the world and particular forms of meaning that we are always navigating and that we are always encountering. And the interesting thing about that is that we don't encounter them as isolated issues. We don't go through our lives and suddenly stumble across a scientific issue that has nothing to do with anything else, and then go through our lives and stumble across a theological issue or a spiritual issue that has nothing to do with anything else. We experience the world in a much more integrated manner. When we encounter the world, we encounter the world, and we recognize that it has a scientific dimension, a philosophical dimension, a spiritual dimension, a moral dimension, an aesthetical dimension. You name it. There's any number of ways of parsing our experience of the world at any given moment. So we're already engaged in this constant ongoing dialogue about how we think the different dimensions of our lives and the different dimensions of the world overlap and interact with one another, how they inform one another, where they challenge one another, where they bump up against one another. I want to list a couple of illustrations that I think will help make the point about some of the ways in which both theology and science and the relationship between them bear on our daily lives. And some of what I'm going to say, before I make this list, I want to say some of what I'm going to mention are potentially controversial issues. What I'm not trying to do is gin up a lot of energy, right, by mentioning controversial issues. The reason I'm mentioning them is because they bear on questions that have to do with our understanding of science and our understanding of theology. But I want to start with something rather benign. One issue that we think about a lot that bears on both theology and science and the relationship between them is the nature of language. Language is essential to everything we do. Language is essential to the exercise of the sciences, and language is essential to the exercise of theology. And yet, neither science nor theology can fully make sense of what language is. There was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist in the 20th century named Eugene Wigner, who once published a paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And what Wigner was trying to get at in that paper was, why does math work? Why does it work as well as it does? There's absolutely no reason that mathematics should work. And yet it does. And not only does it works really well. And it doesn't just work as a way of attaching labels to physical things in the environment around us. It opens up new dimensions of awareness and new dimensions of experience of which we have no empirical experience whatsoever. But the math points us in that direction. And lo and behold, when we follow the breadcrumbs, it leads us into new insights. Wigner's problem was, why should this work? We can't mathematically or scientifically justify that. Same thing with theology. We know that we are forced in some regards to speak about this idea that we call God. How do you do that? How do you begin to talk meaningfully of something that is by definition beyond description? So there is this problem with regards to language and the way in which language functions in both theology and science that gives both of them, keeps both theologians and scientists up at night. We negotiate that question all the time in our daily lives. Tonight I want to give some attention to how we might do that more consciously. Another question that presses on both theological and scientific questions. The evolutionary history of our species. What does that mean? Right? What is the fact that we're reasonably sure now, beyond pretty much any shadow of a doubt, that we have been around for thousands and thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of years? What does it do to our sense of who we are and how we fit in the universe and the role we have in the world to think about ourselves as having evolved from some, what we might want to call, lower life form? What does that do to the way we think about human nature, the role that human beings have in creation, all the rest of it? Theology asks that question, science asks that question. Another example of this, contemporary cosmology. The universe, as we know it, has been around for many, many more years than we have. What does that mean, right? The fact that the history of the cosmos is now in the millions and billions of years, and that our experience of life on this planet has been only just a minuscule fraction of that time. What does that suggest with regards to who we are and our place in the universe? Is there other intelligent life somewhere else in the universe? What might that mean for our understanding of ourselves? What would happen if we were to discover life on some other planet somewhere? How would that shape the way we think about ourselves and our place in the world? What about the ultimate destiny of the universe? There was an Anglican priest who also happened to be a physicist in the 20th century named John Polkinghorne. And Polkinghorne said, when we look at the destiny of the universe from a purely physical, a purely scientific perspective, we know it's going to end badly. We're not sure how, but we know it's going to end badly, right? It's either going to continue to expand indefinitely to the point where you've got nothing left but hydrogen atoms, not great, or it's going to reach a particular point and then contract. And when it contracts, it's going to go back to the level of a singularity, and everything's going to get boiled down to the size of an atom. Neither one of those look good for us, Polkinghorne said. And this is a guy who's both a priest and a physicist. So Polkinghorne says that cosmologically, we can both look back and we can look forward and ask ourselves the question, how do these questions bear on the way we think about who we are and what we do in the world? Questions about the beginning of life. What is a human person? And when does a human person begin to live? How does that affect the way that we think about babies, right? Questions about the end of life. What is a human person, and do human persons have the ability to make decisions about whether or not they can take themselves out of a situation that they find to be unbearable? We've got medically assisted suicide now in Canada. We've got a vote coming in Britain that's possibly going to allow that as well. Is that good? Is that bad? Why or why not? How we think about that bears both on scientific questions and it bears on theological questions. Climate change. Is it happening? What's causing it? What should we do? Et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole range of issues that we could think of here that might, at one point, amend themselves to any number of scientific kinds of questions, scientific resolution, and at the same time lend themselves to any kind of spiritual, moral, or theological question that we might want to ask. My point in saying all of that is, again, not to lift up any one of those as the most important issue or to take a position on any of them, but rather to say we encounter those kinds of questions all the time. We can't help not encounter those kinds of questions. So whatever you think about the dialogue of the relationship between theology and science, you already have a position. You may not know what your position is, but you have already thought about this. You've given some thought to one or another, or probably many of those issues already, and you've already got some sense in your mind as to how this works. So it's not a question that we can avoid, nor is it a question that we should avoid. So, yes, this is indeed relevant. Yes, this indeed impacts us at the level of our daily life. And yes, this indeed gives us a much better opportunity. Engaging the conversation consciously gives us a much better opportunity to engage that stuff in a way that's going to be ultimately more meaningful. Okay, pregnant pause. End of section 1. Section 2, perceived problems in the relationship between faith and science. Why is there a problem? Why is there an issue in the first place? Why can't we all just get along? We can't get along because science has critiqued faith and because faith has critiqued science. What are the problems? Science has critiqued faith in these ways. Number 1, faith does not qualify as knowledge. Faith fails rules of evidence. It fails rules of objectivity. It fails rules of repeatability. It fails rules of generalizability and universalizability, all of which are necessary for science. Faith is too subjective. Faith does not amend itself to proof. Faith does not amend itself to empirical evidence. So for those reasons, science suggests, at least some would argue, science suggests that faith is a problem. Number 2, this is still science's critique of faith. Science is capable of accounting for religious faith. Let's say that we want to take a hard, objectivist scientific line of argument and say, okay, we don't need any faith anymore. Why then is there human religious experience? No problem, science says. We can account for religious experience in human beings as a fortuitous accident. It was an adaptive feature of our evolutionary history that worked for a time to get us over a couple of survival humps. And now that we've gotten over those survival humps, we recognize that we no longer need religious faith. Because the functions that religion had 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, were at the time the only way that we as a species could really manage those problems. But now we're at a point at which we kind of look back and we go, yeah, okay, well, we're past that. Done with that. We tried the square wheel. That didn't work. We went to the round wheel. Same thing with faith and science. We tried faith for a little while. It no longer works within a modern world. Let's get past it. That's the second critique. The third critique, historically, religious faith, owing to its subjectivity, owing to its obscurantism, owing to its fanaticism, historically, religious faith has done more harm than good. This isn't really so much a scientific argument as much as it is a more philosophical or a moral argument, but you will hear people who espouse the superiority of science over faith making this argument quite often. Look at all the damage, so to speak, that religion has done throughout human history. Religion is clearly the byproduct of a bygone age and should now be something that we put behind us. So there's other specific problems that some may want to, what I have not given you is an exhaustive critique of religious belief in today's world, but rather from a scientific perspective, these tend to be some of the arguments that people make the most often. Religion fails as a form of reliable knowledge, as a form of real knowledge. Science is capable now of accounting for religious experience in purely scientific terms, and historically, religious faith has done more harm than good. That's the scientific critique of faith. Here now is the religious critique of science. Number 1, science is incapable of accounting for the whole of the human experience. We've been trying for hundreds of years. We have placed a tremendous amount of faith and a tremendous amount of hope in our ability to come up with a completely objective, completely scientific account of human experience, and we have yet to do so. And there are some who say, well, just a few more years, AI is going to lead us into the bright new future, whatever. But it doesn't seem to be on the near horizon. It seems to almost be at this point an article of faith that science by itself is going to lead us into a better understanding of who we are and what our place in the universe is and how the universe functions. So, first critique, science is incapable of accounting for all of human experience. Number two, only religious faith can provide the necessary context within which science itself can develop. Now, I got to admit, I'm somewhat sympathetic to this. That's basically the argument I'm making tonight. But there are others who have done more work than I'm going to be able to do tonight, demonstrating that historically, if you look at the emergence of the Western scientific tradition, it kind of has a religious and theological foundation, right? It basically starts in the monasteries and then builds from there and grows from there. So philosophically, conceptually, however you want to frame it, metaphysically, the worldview that is necessary for an independent empirical science, tradition of empirical science to emerge and develop in quite the way that it has in our culture requires a particular theological framework. That's the second theological critique of a purely scientific approach to this question. Third one. Purely scientific accounts of human identity degrade the dignity of human beings. This is something that some who would espouse religious faith might say about those who would want to take a strictly scientific reading of human experience and say that human beings are nothing but advanced mammals. That's it. Someone who's living the life of faith might look at that and say, well, no, you've made that person disposable because you've just turned that person into a pile of biological, conglomerate material that happens to be walking around right now, but really fundamentally has no meaning for existing, has no real purpose, has no rational reason for being here as opposed to why should this person or that person or any person be alive? I mean, wouldn't it be better if we just kind of turn the planet back over to the insects and let them run it? It was doing much better before we got here. It's a live argument, right? Those of religious faith might look at that and say that's a problem. You can't do that to human beings. You can't take a human being and try and turn it solely into the same kind of thing that you look at when you see an animal or a plant or whatever, or a virus. Something like so. That's the third religious critique of science. Science is incapable of accounting for all human experience. Only religious faith can provide the necessary context within which science can develop. And third, purely scientific accounts of human identity degrade the dignity of human beings. Okay? So three critiques from science against theology, three critiques from theology against faith. Did anybody notice they were the same critiques? All three of them, right, are the exact same problem, just told from the other side. The first critique has to do with a critique of knowledge. Science says to religious faith, you don't qualify as real knowledge. Theologians, people of faith, might say to scientists, it's those who espouse only science, you have not fully accounted for human experience. Both sides. Your knowledge is inadequate. Second critique has to do with the nature of human identity and human experience. What is a human person? And how are we justified in making claims about the nature of human identity and human nature and human destiny and all the rest of it, human value? What is it that gives that conversation merit? What is it that gives that conversation weight? Those of a purely scientific, or scientistic, I should say, perspective make a claim to that argument, and those of a purely spiritual or theological perspective make a claim to that argument. And then the third critique has to do with historical circumstance. How did we get to where we are right now, and why is science or religion to blame? Right? So the interesting thing about that is that they both have exactly the same concerns, and they both have good reasons for mounting the arguments that they mount. Right? What I don't want to suggest here is that one side or the other is wrong in all three of those arguments. What I want to suggest is that both sides have fundamentally good points to make on those issues. But the fact that they're basically making the same points to one another back and forth means that we haven't yet quite clarified the problem. This is now why I think we need to rethink the nature of the problem. A lot of the science and theology or science and faith discussion founders because it turns on one of those three issues. And we end up fighting a proxy war about something that is not quite as fundamental as the real issue. There's something else going on behind or underneath or whatever you want to call it, all three of those questions that both science and faith want to ask. So I think we need to reframe the question. I think we need to kind of ask ourselves, what is it that is behind those questions? What is it that's beneath those questions that makes those questions so imperative? And how then might we use that reframed understanding of the problem as a way of re-engaging our understanding of the relationship between faith and science? How am I doing? Oh, yeah. That's just a joke. Never mind the man over there on the side. Okay. Third section, rethinking the nature of the problem. I'm going to take a page here from the American philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who wrote a book called Where the Conflict Really Lies. Plantinga, for those of you who may not know, is an analytical philosopher who is also a Christian. He's in the Reformed tradition. He taught for years at Notre Dame, wrote a number of books, a number of topics, very well thought of, very well respected individual in American philosophical circles. Plantinga's argument in his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, is this. He says, we have fundamentally misunderstood the controversy between science and faith, here it comes, because the problem is actually not science and faith. Theology has no trouble whatsoever. Religious faith has no problem whatsoever with the practice of science. And when you get right down to it, science doesn't have any problem with spirituality as well. The problem is naturalism. The problem is actually a philosophical worldview that tries to draw on science for its justification and then go on to make moral and anthropological and cosmological and religious claims. Now that's different. Note what Plantinga just said. What Plantinga is arguing is that there is a philosophical and, if we get right down to it, a religious perspective that looks at modern science and says, that's working pretty well. I'm going to use that as ballast for my philosophical or religious argument. And I'm going to claim that there can be nothing like the supernatural, or there is no God, or human beings have no dignity and freedom, or whatever, right? And I'm going to say that the reason that I'm making that argument is because science now demonstrates that this is the case. But in point of fact, Plantinga argues, that's not science, that's naturalism. That is the attempt to appropriate and apply and interpret an ostensibly scientific conclusion to a moral or an anthropological or a religious, spiritual, philosophical question. Now, Plantinga is not saying that you can't apply scientific findings to philosophical questions. Plantinga says you have to do that. The question becomes, what is the philosophical or better religious framework within which you're doing that? Because that will make all the difference. In other words, the real question here is a religious one. The real issue in the debate between theology and science, or the debate between faith and science, has little less to do with the debate between people who have a religious belief and people who don't have, or people who want to believe solely in silence. It's rather between people who have one kind of religious belief and people who have a different kind of religious belief. This is a religious and theological argument before it is an argument between theology and anything else. Okay? So I think he's right. I think that's basically right. If you take all three of the questions that we looked at a few minutes ago, having to do with the nature of knowledge, the nature of human experience, whatever, you take any of those issues that we talked about earlier on that kind of press these buttons for us, the nature of the cosmos, the meaning of the nature, the meaning of evolution, all that stuff, genetic engineering, you name it, artificial intelligence, human distinctiveness, whatever. Fundamentally, if you chase those down far enough, you're going to end up with what is essentially a religious or a theological question. And that's pretty much unavoidable. So it's not that we have to import a religious character or a religious nature to the question. It's just there waiting to be found, waiting to be discovered. And once you uncover the nature of the question, the trick is, Plantinga suggests, the trick is to address it in the proper way. Don't try to turn it into something that it's not. Don't try to turn this fundamentally religious or philosophical question into an empirical one, because that way lies madness. It's not going to work. You will end up squeezing all the content and squeezing all the meaning of the question out of itself in an attempt to reframe it. So, as a world, just to kind of round out this section, The reason that naturalism has kind of intruded itself into this conversation is because it wants to borrow the burnished image of the modern empirical sciences as a way of justifying its claims. But in point of fact, naturalism strictly applied not only rules out religious faith, if you apply it strictly enough, it will also rule out the empirical sciences. This is a problem that philosophers discovered in the 19th century when there was kind of a new enthusiasm for the application of objective rational thought in the exercise of moral questions and religious questions and spiritual questions. They thought, that's it, we're going to get serious, we're going to get strictly objective about all this stuff. What they soon found is they had ruled out the possibility of knowledge altogether. Even science went away, right? And it starts to show up even as early as like David Hume, right? In the 17th century. Hume says, well, I have no idea how to answer this, so I'm going to go play backgammon instead. Okay. The thing that I think is most helpful for our purposes is that it helps to reframe the conversation as one that is fundamentally about questions of a religious nature. Okay? That's my cue that I just have a few minutes left. So if we set aside naturalism and we allow faith and science to meet on their own terms, what happens? Here's the last section. Okay. Here's where it gets good. Pay attention to this part. Everything else I said is introduction. It is the Christian, distinctly Christian doctrine of creation that not only makes empirical science possible, it is the thing that invites and makes the empirical sciences necessary. In other words, if you want the lab, go first to the church. The church invites and welcomes into its existence the lab as we understand it today. Why is that? Because the Christian account of creation is one that allows for and encourages an exploration of the natural order on its own terms. The world is God's good creation and so is related to God, but by virtue of the nature of the divine creative act, the world has a relative independence and autonomy from God. And that's very important because what that means is that when we go out into the world and we look around and we're exploring things in the natural order, what we're not doing is mucking around with the divine being, right? In other words, we don't have to worship plants. We can ask questions about them. We don't have to worship animals or stars or the world or other human beings or whatever because God is the creator of all of it. And God has given all of it into our care to steward and to shepherd and to bring into the fullness of its life. Empirical science is one of the ways that we do that. If the world was related to God in a way that the divine life and the created life were kind of inextricably bound up with one another, we couldn't do that. We couldn't do that at all because everything would be so sacred that you can't go mucking around with some of that kind of stuff, right? So the Christian doctrine of creation allows for both a relatedness between the creator and the creation, but also enough of a distinction to allow science to operate on its own terms without always having to ask theologians and priests and all the rest of us how they're supposed to go about their work. A physicist comes to the church and says, how do I do this? We say, I don't know, figure it out. And then tell us what you come up with, because we'd like to know. Right? So there's a couple of further consequences that follow from the fact that this is a created world that make the empirical sciences necessary and valuable. The world as creation is not necessary. The world is contingent. Again, very important scientifically, because what this means is that if you want to do the empirical sciences, you need to get out into the field. Right? You can't just sit back in your armchair and come up with abstract first principles and expect that you're going to come to a reasonable understanding of the cosmos. We tried that. We tried that for a long time. We tried that for a couple hundred years. It really didn't work all that well. And then we discovered empirical investigation, and lo and behold, the lights went on. It's like, oh, this is how you do this. But if the creation was not relatively independent of the creator, then we could sit back and just use philosophical and religious first principles as a way of deducing ourselves to an understanding of the cosmos. That's not how science works. And the discovery of the empirical sciences as a method of inquiry and not just as a method of the application of first principles was one of the first things that got the empirical sciences going in the modern period. It was a tremendously important shift, not only for the sciences, but also for theology, because theology proceeds along the same route. The world as creation is not meaningless. It may be contingent, but it's not meaningless. It is meaningful. When we see patterns in nature, when we see beauty in nature, we respond to those things morally. We respond to those things aesthetically. We don't just look at a random series and suddenly discern some kind of pattern and go, okay, well, that's interesting, duly noted. Next. I mean, there's something intriguing about that. There's something beautiful about that. There's something that attracts and draws us to that. We recognize a pattern and we say, there is truth. I need more of that. I want to go deeper. And it draws us into a deeper apprehension of a deeper pattern. What's going on behind that? What's going on behind that? That quest for deeper and deeper levels of truth is what spurs the scientific enterprise. The moment we start to get bored, that's when we begin to suspect we've got a bad problem here. We're asking the wrong question. If our investigation starts to peter out, or if we start to feel like this is no longer interesting, then we're probably asking the wrong question. The conduct of the empirical sciences is nothing other than the search for better and better questions. Your conclusion, your deduction, the outcome of your theory should lead to a deeper apprehension of the meaning and the pattern of reality, which should itself lead to further questions. If it's not doing that, it's not good science. And the same is true for faith as well. So we have a world that is created, that is contingent, that is open to empirical investigation, but is still related to God. It's not a world that has been created and then spun off and disconnected from its creator in a way that detaches the meaning of its life from the creator. So empirical questions, not surprisingly, open onto moral ones. They open onto philosophical ones. They open onto ethical ones and aesthetic ones and social ones and religious ones. So the conduct of the empirical sciences properly understood will naturally open us to wider and wider horizons of meaning, which we recognize each have their own independent criteria for going about the work that it is they're doing. That's how we find ourselves living in a world saturated by meaning. And it's when we begin to apprehend that meaning and that connection between things that's when things get really exciting. So all of that is to suggest that, let me just kind of quickly review the four sections. The discussion between faith and science, absolutely essential to daily life. This is part and parcel of what we do. And it's not just a matter of practicalities, it's also a very contemplative question. Science, the best scientists will say that science is a contemplative discipline. The best theologians will say theology is a contemplative discipline. Second thing that we found, we have to reframe the conversation. We have to reframe the problem to really get a good sense of it. And then that led us to a consideration of how the doctrine of creation allows for the practice of the empirical sciences. I want to close with two passages, one just a bit longer and then one very short. Both of these tried, I think, in really good ways to summarize the argument I'm trying to make. Here's an example from the Bible of the practice of the empirical sciences. This is what science looks like in practice, according to the Bible. The Lord God made the heavens and the earth, and out of the ground, the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the cattle and all the birds of the air and to every animal of the field. What is that? That's a quark. Okay? What is that? That's a gluon. Okay? What does that mean? Well, quarks and gluons are related like this. That's very interesting. What else can you do with that? There it is, right there. I mean, that is not the empirical sciences are nothing other than human beings living into the God-given mandate to go out and name the creation and discover the creation, and in so doing, to help the different components and different dimensions of the creation come into a better fit and come into better alignment. We are the point of creation that God has put here to bring all the different dimensions of creation together and align them in a pattern that bears witness to the divine image. So the Bible, from chapter 2 of the first book of the Bible, immediately tracks towards the empirical sciences. Second passage is a quote from an Anglican priest from the 20th century named Geoffrey Stuart Kennedy. Kennedy was a poet, and he was a theologian as well. At one point he was engaged, there's an essay he's got where he's talking about the relationship between faith and reason, and Stuart Kennedy said this. I think this is powerful in a number of ways, but it kind of summarizes everything I'm trying to say here tonight. Religion does not relieve us of the duty of thought. That in and of itself is important because that's what oftentimes a lot of people will accuse people who are religious of being. Stuart Kennedy says, no, the opposite. Religion does not relieve us of the duty of thought. Rather, religion makes it possible for us to begin thinking. Thank you very much.
Good job. Thank you so much, Andrew. We're going to take a 10-minute break, but before you break, QR code, do the survey, get in the raffle, and do not be stunned into silence by his brilliance. I now want you to shake his foundations with really good questions. 10 minutes, we'll call you back. All right, I got to tell you, you gave Andrew a panic attack. I think we got between 40 and 45 questions, and they were all really good. So I'm going to actually say this so he doesn't have to. You will not hear all the answers, but he says he wants to treat it like speed dating, and he will do as many as he can. So buckle up. We've got 20 minutes of hearing questions answered, and then we're going to say a little something at the end. Andrew Grosso.
Question 1, can you slow down? No. Question 2, in view of Indiana's Game 7 loss last night, do you still believe in God? Absolutely. How am I doing? Okay, before I get to the real questions, I'm very impressed by the thoughtfulness of the questions. It is clear that this is an issue that touches the heart of many of you at a number of different levels. It touches the mind of a number of you at a number of different levels. I am not going to be able to answer really any of these to any profound satisfaction tonight, but I am always available to talk further. So if at some point you want to take me to the mat on the question of evolution or hear more about how I think the doctrine of the incarnation bears on the practice of the scientific method, I would love to get together and have a conversation with you about that. So I apologize in advance if I'm not going to be able to get to, even if I do get to your question and don't answer it to your satisfaction, please feel free to give me a call and we'll talk later. Okay. There were a number of questions that bear on the question of human nature. Why are human beings so special? How do we know human beings are so special? What justification do we have for saying that human beings are so special? Do we have anything other than a spiritual justification for saying that human beings are so special? I would suggest that we have a profoundly scientific justification for saying that human beings are so special. We are, to the best of our knowledge, we are the only beings who have these kinds of conversations, right? There's no other form of life that we are aware of in the universe that engages in these kinds of conversations and that engages in these kinds of questions and that uses these kinds of questions as a way of pushing into deeper about questions about who we are and what are the meaning of our existence, our place in the world. That I don't have to be religious to see that. I mean, that's a purely scientific hypothesis. That's a purely scientific account of what I think human experience suggests to us. So there is, I think, a really interesting alignment between the way that science presents human beings as pattern-seeking animals. That's a title of a recent book on the nature of human persons. Sorry for the switching back and forth, reading glasses, not reading glasses. That I think bears witness to ways in which we can account for the distinctiveness of human identity without necessarily having to say that human beings are therefore somehow elevated above the natural order. Neither science nor Christian theology would say that human beings occupy some kind of elevated place above the natural order. It is by virtue of our being embedded in the natural order that our vocation is lived out, that our identity as human persons is lived out. It's not that we're spiritual beings dropped into an otherwise unspiritual world. We are simply that part of the entirely spiritually infused world, natural cosmos, that has been called forth to bear witness to the meaning of all of it. This is what it means to exercise the priesthood of all creation. We are naturally integrated into the whole created order in a way that allows us to bear witness to the meaning of all of it in a way that the rest of it simply cannot. So I would suggest that that's both a scientifically validated and a theologically valid way of thinking about human nature. Does that give us a position of superiority? Does that give us a position that allows us to use and abuse the world as we want? It gives us exactly every reason to do the opposite. It gives us a reason rather to recognize that what we are called to do is to act as the great high priest himself does and serve, be the first who serves all creatures. That's what being a steward is about. It's about shepherding and stewarding and guiding the property of someone other than yourself. Okay. There were a whole bunch of questions having to do with the nature of religious knowledge and the nature of scientific knowledge. can we say scientifically, can we say theologically or spiritually that we are more or less justified in believing either in the Bible or in particular scientific principles or rest of it? How do we resolve, how do we resolve the apparent scientific absurdities in the scriptures? How do we resolve some of the apparent scientific absurdities that we see being claimed about things that science may want to say about human nature and human experience? I think that what we're bumping into there is something that we talked about earlier tonight, having to do with the way in which we encounter the world in an integrated, holistic way. When we encounter another person, we don't encounter them as kind of sliced up into different dimensions, scientific over here, the spiritual over here, et cetera, et cetera. We encounter them as an integrated organism that meets us in action, and therefore it's kind of incumbent on us to have to step back a little bit and ask, what's the best perspective to get at this dimension or that dimension of this reality that I'm now trying to better understand? It's when we fail to do that we try and dump all the meaning of a particular encounter or a particular event or a particular reality into a single mode of discourse. That's when the train goes off the tracks. So if we find that we're asking scientific questions on the basis of the scriptures, then I think we're misusing the scriptures. If we find that we're trying to answer moral or spiritual questions on the basis of the latest findings in physics, then we're misusing physics. Part of the issue here has to do with sorting out the best tools to use to address the questions you really want to ask. And again, we found in our earlier discussion, we found that we had to kind of work through a couple of layers to get to the real fundamental question. There's always a question behind the question, and oftentimes we'll try and answer the question, whatever it is, whether it's a spiritual question or a scientific question or a moral one or whatever. We'll try to sort that out at a level that makes us more comfortable, because we don't want to do the harder work of going a bit deeper and plunging a bit more into some of the uncertainties that unfold when we start getting into the reality of the mystery that we're presented with. So treating things appropriate to the kind of question we're asking and making sure that we're asking the right question about whatever it is we're trying to better understand. Okay. Why didn't God just make it all clearer? I think that has everything to do with the integrity of the creation. God not only respects the integrity of the creation, he respects our integrity. And if we are to be bearers of the divine image, if we are to be the ones who bear witness to the nature of God in the world and to exercise the divine vocation, to exercise God's sovereignty, and to be the ministers of God's mercy in the world, then God is going to have to allow us a certain degree of independence and a certain degree of freedom, properly understood, just as God is going to have to allow the world to enjoy a certain amount of freedom and a certain amount of integrity. In other words, God does not seem to be in the business of creating a world or creating human persons that are under God's immediate control. That does not seem to be the purpose for which God has created the world. Because, from a Christian perspective, we would say that's not who God is. God himself exists in relationship. God exists as a trinity of persons in a unity of being, and what that means is that the inherently relational nature of God is not one that is bound by strictly deterministic laws. It's bound by relationship, and it's characterized by shared love and by shared intimacy. If God is to have the same kind of relationship with the world that God enjoys in the divine life, then that same kind of dynamic is going to have to be at play. What God is interested in doing is creating a world that he can relate to without overwhelming it, right? Without either being absent from it, without being distant from it, but without overwhelming it by being in too close proximity to it. He has to create a world that he can look at and say, beloved. And he has to create a world that can look back at him and say, beloved. And you can only get that if you've got that relative, if you've got a relational account of what it looks like for God and the world to exist with one another, rather than for them to be so close that one or the other gets swallowed up in the other. Are you familiar with Stephen Jay Gould's principle of the non-overlapping megasteria? Yes, I am. Yes, it doesn't work. Gould was a scientist who, for many, many years, some of you may have heard some of his arguments, Gould tried to demonstrate that on the basis of the modern sciences, we no longer could expect that religious truth really had anything to offer to human beings. And for many years, that was kind of his go-to line. And he encountered so much resistance that eventually, I think, he offered the idea of the non-overlapping megasteria as kind of a white flag. He's like, all right, whatever. His idea was that science is over here, and religious faith is over here, and they're kind of apart, and you guys have your domain over here, and science has its domain over there, and everybody just kind of back to your corner, and let's just all go about the world in peace. Lovely. Can we stop fighting? It doesn't really work. It's an interesting idea, but it doesn't really work because, again, the world we encounter is not a world that is parsed up into different domains that can be neatly hived off from one another. Now, whether or not science and the empirical science, or excuse me, whether or not theology and the empirical sciences can be brought into immediate relation, that I'm less sure of. I think there's probably a need for some kind of mediating domain that allows for some kind of cross-fertilization between the two. I'm not sure that quantum physics and Trinitarian theology have a lot in common, but I think both of them might have philosophical ramifications that might be sorted out within the context of philosophical studies that might then be translated to those other domains. So I wouldn't necessarily say that every empirical science has to be brought into immediate relationship with every theological question or every theological doctrine or issue. I'm happy to allow for a mediation between any number of disciplines. I think that can happen in a variety of different ways. But I don't think the idea of non-overlapping magisteria really works because we don't encounter the world in that way. We don't live in that way. We recognize that pretty much every dimension of our experience in varying ways and to varying degrees is going to have scientific, political, social, moral, aesthetic, religious questions. Once we give that up, if we stop counting on the unity of truth, then we're living in a very strange world. And then we have different problems. So, there were several questions having to do with how we talk to people who have a very militant view on this question, either from a scientific perspective or from a religious question. How do I talk to somebody who disagrees with me about this? Either how do I talk to someone who's very religious and wants to claim that the Bible has scientific truth in it, or how do I talk to a scientist who has no time whatsoever for the idea of God? I think that the trick to both of those is to help the person get behind their question, to get behind their animus. I hear you saying that you feel it's important that the Bible is recognized as an authority for all truth claims. Why do you believe that? Tell me what that's about. What's going on there? What do you think would happen if that were applied universally? Is it really the case that we want all questions answered in this particular way? Or I hear you saying that you believe that the study of modern sociobiology or whatever rules out the possibility of belief in God. Why do you believe that? What would happen to our understanding of modern sociobiology if there was a God? And why do you think that implication or that consequence would necessarily follow? Oftentimes people will hold positions that they haven't even really fully articulated to themselves. They just know that there's a truth there, and this is interesting because this gives us a clue as to how both science and spirituality work. There's an intuitive sense that there's some meaningful pattern there. We're not quite sure what it is, but we've got to hold on to that. What's that about? The minute you start engaging in that kind of more exploratory work, you're doing both what the empirical sciences and what theological studies do in their best days. You're getting behind the surface appearance to the deeper reality beneath them. There were several questions that were asking about the role of Jesus in all of this and the way in which Jesus functions in the conversation between theology and science. I would say that, and I'm not going to be able to talk a lot about this, sorry, but I would say that the doctrine of the incarnation is absolutely essential for a proper understanding of the doctrine of creation. It's not just that we have a doctrine of creation in which the relationship between God and the world is posited in the abstract. Rather, we see by virtue of the incarnation, speaking from a Christian perspective, of course, we see by virtue of the incarnation God's intention for the world. God wants something like that for human beings, right? That is what a human person looks like. A human person looks like that guy from Nazareth. So the destiny and the nature and the purpose of what human beings are here to do looks something like that. And how do we know that? We know that by virtue of what we saw God doing in and through the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, from a non-Christian perspective, that's not going to get a lot of truck. That's fine. Now we have an evangelistic opportunity, right? Now we can have a conversation about why the doctrine of the incarnation makes sense as a way in which God would have revealed himself within the world. And everything that the doctrine of the incarnation means for the way we think not only about human experience and human identity and human destiny, but also what it means for thinking about the broader creation. Because, not incidentally, what does the Bible say about the incarnation? In the beginning was the Word, right? All things were created in and through the Word. All things were created for the Word, and the Word became flesh. The thing that animates and gives structure and order and meaning to the whole creation itself, himself, became flesh and walked among us. That is an astonishing thought. But that is one of the clearest clues we have to both the scientific meaning of the world and the spiritual meaning of the world. So there's tons that could be said about the doctrine of the incarnation and the way in which that helps us unpack both of those dimensions. Okay. Okay, there were several questions about the way in which religious thought and scientific thought develop and change. One of the things that one of the questions that was asked made the point, the accurate point, that scientific discoveries are open to new discoveries, are open to new learning. And isn't that different in some way from theological studies? Once you get a doctrine, once you get an idea about God, isn't it something that you kind of lock down and stop thinking about? No, the exact opposite. And the reason for that has everything to do with the church's mission in the world. The church is constantly called upon to refresh and renew its understanding of the gospel because the church is always moving into new missionary, new evangelistic territory. How do we go out and preach to everything in creation, right? When Jesus sends the disciples out, he doesn't just say, go to the human beings. He said, go to all creation and preach the word. How do we do that if we're not constantly learning how Christian faith bears on this, or how Christian faith bears on that, or how Christian faith bears on whatever new situation, new context, new challenge appears before us? We're constantly moving into an unfolding creation that is potentially, at least, always bearing witness to deeper and deeper and wider degrees of meaning. So we're never going to be done exhausting the meaning of the gospel, or the meaning of the incarnation, or the meaning of what it means to say that God is in relation with the world. That's something we will always be exploring. So that calls the church, back to the question here, that calls the church to the careful, hard, challenging, but exciting work of constant discernment. What is it God is calling us to do right now? In some respects, that exactly mirrors what's constantly going on in the empirical sciences. What are the frontier problems? Where are the real questions, right? In the midst of whatever nonsense may be happening in the empirical sciences at any particular moment, scientists are fairly confident that there's a bunch of stuff that's going on that is going to lead nowhere. Where are the really good questions? Those are the questions that will make or break your scientific career. Don't get sidetracked by minutiae, don't get sidetracked by irrelevancies. Find yourself a really good question and bear down on it. You can give that advice to a scientist. You can give that exact same advice to a Christian missionary going out into the world, because the meaning of the gospel is one that will never be exhausted by any particular historical or social or cultural context. We're constantly moving into deeper meaning. Okay, last two.
You have time for one more. Okay.
Some people say nature is inherent religious and that electrons practice religion, which is incredible because I didn't know they even said Mass. Okay. Even had Mass. This was my favorite one. Paul said, drink a glass of wine daily for your ailments, but science doesn't seem to support that. How do you reconcile? I'd like a nice Pinot Noir with this question. There's actually an article in a recent edition of Plow Quarterly. There's a magazine that was an issue that just came out. The title of the journal is Plow Quarterly, and there's an article in there by a guy named Malcolm Geet, who's an Anglican priest and poet. And the article is basically about his smoking habit and his drinking habit. And he says, both smoking and drinking are bad for me. Why do I still do them? I refer you to Malcolm Geet in Plow Quarterly. Any book recommendations for someone new to this depth of exploration of the topic? Yes, I have about 20 books for you. See me after class. Thank you very much.
Whew, I found myself breathing for him. That is hard to do, what he just did. Andrew, thank you for really challenging us, being so clear. Come on, come out here where everyone can thank you. If you like what you heard, come to church. All right, few thank yous before we wrap up here. What's that? Yeah, that too. So, Vector Brewing, we are so grateful for you. We know you're closed on Monday, and the fact that you open up for us, we are super grateful. Thank you. Our AV team right here, who makes us sound good and look good, we're super grateful. And by the way, when Brian kept getting up, it's because the sun kept messing with his camera, and so he had to fix that. So thank you. Sarah, we said thank you to you. The Pub Theology Committee, particularly Justin Brooks and Bob Johnston, for this dream you have for Pub Theology and the way you bring it to being. Thank you. And last but most importantly, thank you for being in relationship with one another, for spending time together, and for really going deeper into this great creation God has given us. Thank you for being here tonight. Enjoy yourself. Have a wonderful night.